This is the second video in this three-part series. In this part, I'll explain why the 15% delegate threshold can make it difficult for the Democratic Party establishment to stop an insurgent candidate in a wide presidential field. I recommend you listen to the first part, but to give a quick recap, I covered the fact that it was mathematically possible to win a majority of the delegates before the convention with only around 10% of the popular vote. Now, of course, that's an extreme, practically impossible situation, but that's meant to illustrate the fact that it's well within the realm of possibility to go into the convention with around 40% of the popular vote and have 55% of the delegates and win on the first ballot. It is indeed the possibility of this happening that would trigger candidates dropping out / being pushed out of the race if, for example, there's an insurgent candidate that multiple factions of the party all oppose more than they want to see their own person win. The problem for everyone who isn't the insurgent candidate, however, is organizing against such a candidate is a crapshoot. Yes, every additional candidate in a race getting a significant chunk of the vote that's less than 15% vastly increases the value of votes for candidates above the threshold mark. However, getting candidates to drop out to try and coalesce around an alternative isn't without risk. For example, for simplicity's sake, let's put the distinction between district and state aside for a moment and imagine a New Hampshire primary in which all 24 delegates are selected statewide. Say candidate A, the insurgent, is polling at around 26% of the vote, and candidate B, the more established, acceptable moderate, is polling at around 19%. And now also imagine nobody else is polling above 15%. As that currently stands, the insurgent candidate would be set to get 14 of the 24 delegates, and even worse for the establishment, momentum going into the Nevada primaries and beyond. Now imagine there's a candidate C that's polling as high as 13% in recent polls, but candidate B is seen as having a better chance at beating the insurgent. So, through various machinations, candidate C is convinced to drop out. However, perhaps unpredictably, of that 13%, 9 of that ends up going to the insurgent and only 3% of that to the moderate, the last 1% going to protest votes or other candidates. The insurgent now has 35% of the vote, and the moderate has 22%. The delegate breakdown would now be 15 to 9, and you've just handed the insurgent a 10 plus percentage point victory, in addition to leaving with nearly twice as many delegates. The further interesting thing here is that had that 9 to 3 breakdown gone the opposite direction, with the 9 going to the moderates and the 3 to the insurgent would still win the primary, 29 to 28%. It's a lesser victory, but the main thing that was trying to be avoided by the establishment here was having a victory at all. New Hampshire doesn't have plenty of delegates, but it sets a tone for the race, and in this case, you'd have a victory by the insurgent in a narrowing field, further legitimizing them in the eyes of future voters. So perhaps it's considered that don't force candidate C out of the primaries at all. That's all well and good, but 26 versus 19% versus 13% is still 14 delegates for the insurgent candidate. In fact, God forbid both candidate B and C consider themselves rivals in being the one to take down the insurgent and negatively campaign against each other until candidate B falls below the 15% threshold without pulling candidate C above the 15% threshold, and the insurgent ends up walking away with all of the delegates and a narrative of disarray among their opponents, further strengthening their case as a unifying candidate among voters. It's also important to remember, through all this, we're talking about said insurgent winning the majority of the delegates in a state without even touching 40% of the popular vote. As you notice in this scenario, around a third of the vote is still out there among the other candidates, but you have the same problems of votes leaking to the insurgent to worry about if they drop out, and also the issue of potential rivalries dragging down the opposition to the insurgent, if you don't curb them. Another thing to consider is that these decisions will have to be made quickly. Remember when I pointed out by March 10th a near majority of delegates will have been already selected? Well, just a week before that, nearly 40% of delegates will have been selected. So there's precious little time to figure out and deploy a strategy to slow down a runaway insurgent. Lastly, for this scenario, we have to remember when we're talking about something as vague as the establishment plotting against an insurgent, we must remember that these candidates are not perfect puppets on strings. They have power bases of advisors, donors, organizations, and their own ambitions to consider that are either leading them to miscalculate their actual position, they aren't willing to stop an insurgent at the cost of completely erasing their own chances, or they might even be willing to reach out and collaborate with the insurgent campaign. Combined, stopping an insurgent, even a candidate that doesn't have a majority of the vote, nonetheless barreling towards a majority of delegates, is much harder to do than it might seem at first. Now, all of the above, remember, is operating around a simplified scenario in which New Hampshire assigned all its delegates on a state level. Those same unpredictable delegate breakdown scenarios will be happening both at the district and state level. Now, all of this has made it pretty clear that something absolutely critical to the success of a presidential campaign, insurgent or not, is hitting the threshold everywhere. Not only does this guarantee you delegates, it denies your opponents the ability to run away with a disproportionate amount of the delegates. Now that's the end of Part 2. In Part 3, I'll explain why performing well on a district-by-district level is more important than simply racking up the statewide vote total. Thanks for watching this video. Please like, share, subscribe, and click that notification bell to be alerted when I release new videos.